I'm saying? Like, than all of these people. All right, so here's what's funny. It's fun. These are fun. Those were so much better than I thought they were going to be. Those are great. It's funny when you start dating people, you realize pretty quick, like there are like facades that most of us can put up for a certain amount of time, to make us cooler or a little bit more likable or those kinds of things. But at some point along the way, at some point along the way, that stuff goes away. It might be date 2 where somebody says the dress thing or ask how it went in the bathroom. It might happen pretty quick, but for some people, it might take longer. And at some point along the way, again, nobody's perfect and everybody's got their quirks, but at some point, you begin to see people, and all of a sudden, their things kind of bubble up. And then the other truth is this, for you too, your stuff starts to bubble up. And we all have our own stuff. We all have our own quirks and weirdness. And then we also have our own things that cause conflict in relationships. And so what we're going to do for the next few minutes is we're going to take like a deep dive into this. So today, we're going to be really, really practical. We're going to look at a handful of passages that talk to or speak to conflict, so we'll look at that. But just to get us all caught up, in case you've missed the last few weeks, we said this early on, that we believe that God wants us to have great marriages. So if you're gonna get married, you're gonna have a marriage, we would say this: God wants you to have a great one. And though Scripture is fascinating on this, you have this whole wide sort of range of what relationships look like. Like sometimes people come up to me and they're like, "Hey, we want to have a biblical marriage," and I'm like, "That's kind of hard to talk about because, the Old Testament, it gets kind of weird quick in parts of the Old Testament, and then you move through and then you have New Testament stuff. It's fascinating." But we would say this: as you look at the arc of Scripture, there is an ideal for what God has called us to have when it comes to relationships and what we believe that God would have us to be like in marriage. And so when it comes to that, there are ways to do this well. And then the Scriptures do speak a lot to the practical sides of what relationships look like. And so we say God wants you to have a great marriage. The other one is this: that great marriages begin before you say I do. And so we started talking about this early on, but long before you even start dating people, long before you have awkward first dates with people, long before you even do any of that, you are really, sort of preparing yourself for what marriage is going to be like by focusing on you. And so we said this, every week so far, but if you're single in the room and you do want to be married someday, I tell people all the time that you can constantly be looking, you can constantly be on the hunt, you can whatever. But at some point along the way, you say, I'm running this direction. I'm running towards what God has called me to do and who God has called me to be. And at some point along the way, as cheesy as it might sound or whatever, at the end of the day, someone sees you and begins running alongside of you with their own individual calling, and you start running together. And then together, God does something amazing through you, through marriage. So we talked about that. And then the other thing that we said early on is this: that the decisions, right? The decisions that you make before marriage, right? The decisions you make before marriage reinforce the habits that will shape the marriage that you try to build, right? So this is a little bit of what we talked about last week. That the decisions you make before you ever get married, right? Your past, right? It certainly, I don't believe it disqualifies you, but it informs where you are and often informs the trajectory that you're on. So if you don't course correct or if you don't make adjustments, at some point along the way, you're moving in a direction, and that direction matters so much. The habits that you're building now, they matter so much. And most of us are simultaneously building good habits. Most of us also have habits that are just slightly off, that 3 years from now or 5 years or 10 years from now really pull us in this direction. And then some of us have habits and hangups that are like over here and taking us really away from what God's called us to do. And so we say we got to focus on those habits because it's going to shape what we're trying to build. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to launch from this statement, and here's where we're going to kind of spend the bulk of our time today, and that's this: that marriage is a challenge because we all carry our own unique baggage, right? So we've said this a little bit along the way, but your story is unique, and it's also not that unique. Like, it's both, right? So we could go around the room right now and talk about the specific parts of your story, and what you would probably find, especially in a room this size, is someone else grew up in a similar family that you grew up in. Someone else grew up in similar hurts and pains than you grew up in. So, someone else grew up with job stuff or weird first dates. We've already done this. Most of us have some sort of weirdness around a date. You've had all these sorts of things. Most of us have a unique story that's also not that unique. But what is fascinating is your personality, all of you brought to those experiences, will shape your view of every relationship that you have moving forward, right? And so I put in my notes and said this, a lot of what informs this for us is our hurts. The ways that you have been uniquely hurt will shape your future marriage and your conflict. And the ways that you were hurt as a kid, as a teenager, as a 20-something, as a 30-something, those unique hurts, even though everybody shares them, your unique hurts will inform your future when it comes to your marriage. And I'll tell you how this works. You get married or you're in a relationship for a long time and you realize this, that there were things that are triggers for you that pop up that you didn't even know were triggers, and the other person said something about something odd, and all of a sudden they get the full force of your own pain in that moment, and you don't even know that you're doing it. Sometimes people don't even realize how angry they are or how angry they come off, and it's often because of a past hurt that's coming to the forefront in those moments. Similarly, but a little bit different, is your wound. And so these are things that you've maybe processed through, and maybe you have scars with, but those scars also inform your ability to be vulnerable, your openness in relationships. Those wounds, right, those processed hurt or pain, those wounds will inform where you're going. And then my favorite one, and you know this one too, we don't probably even have to talk about this very long, but your expectations around what somebody else should be or could be or what they said they were going to be and then they're not, your expectations of the other person will inform the vast majority of your conflict, right? Now, when you're dating too, you see this, you get like the best version of somebody for an X amount of time. And then at some point along the way, your expectations of them, either spoken or unspoken, will create some variation of conflict. And when it creates conflict, right, specifically around your expectations, this is what's funny. Your gap in expectation and the reality of who they are or who they are in this season, what you fill that gap with will shape your relationship probably more than anything else. When there's an expectation gap, you either fill it with trust or suspicion. Some people fill it with contempt. Along the way, it always is sort of morphing, but whatever you fill that expectation gap with will inform your conflict. Now, the last thing we're going to say, and then we're going to jump into some passages in a second, is this. Conflict is present in all relationships, right? So let me just tell you, you are not going to have a conflict-free relationship, hopefully dating experiences. I tell people all the time that are dating, and when they get towards like being engaged too, a lot of people come to us when they're engaged and we do premarital stuff. If they haven't fought yet, part of my goal in premarital is to get them to fight. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think you need to fight at some point. I just want to poke it, let's just see what happens, and then I'll just both sit there like, it's great, it's fun to watch. Okay, but and here's why this matters so much. Your conflict will come at some point along the way. And for people that are dating or engaged, I always tell people you don't want to just gloss over it. You want to be fully in whatever that conflict is, because at some point it's going to happen. Now, conflict exists in all relationships, but the truth is healthy conflict is not present in all relationships. Conflict exists in every one of our relationships. Healthy conflict does not exist in all of our relationships. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how do we have that healthy conflict. Now, two of my favorite people to read on relationships, it's John and Julie Gottman, and they have such really powerful presence in their writings and the things that they talk about. They're fascinating, and it's funny. He's sort of this stat's probably blown out of proportion a little bit, but he's sort of coined as being a psychologist who figured out that as he was counseling couples, he found that there was one sort of common sort of trait among couples who they could predict that they would one day get divorced. And often that thing centered around contempt, right? If you can sense contempt in a relationship, once it gets to that point, then all of a sudden you're on a really bad trajectory, and that's the thing we got to fix. Now, which he's sort of famous for. His writings on this are fascinating. But the part that I love, or one of my favorite quotes by him, doesn't center around the contempt part. It actually centers around, 3 or 4 steps back when it talks about anger in relationships or conflict. And he says this, and I love it. He says, in a good relationship, people get angry, which is obvious. People get angry. But in a very different way. The marriage masters see a problem a bit like a soccer ball. They kick it around, and the view of it is this. This problem, whatever the problem is our problem. Now, I'll just tell you this. We've been married for a while, and we dated for a lot longer, too, than a lot of people. I would say this is something that looks really great on paper and is very hard to flesh out, right? So this is one of those things that you could say, and everybody sort of says this about the relationship until you're in a fight. But when you're in a fight, generally what's happening is I'm trying to win, and then she's trying to win, and then we are trying to one-up each other and how we are going to win, right? And this is funny, and you've seen this. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's really not. But you get to a point where if winning is the goal, or even this, even being understood is the end goal for you, right? If this is the kind of one-upping sort of scenario, then what you've done is you've created a me versus you, I'm against you sort of thing in the relationship. And that will never work, right? You've heard this said before, I'm sure, in some various ways, but you can win an argument and lose the heart. You can win the argument and lose the relationship. You can win the argument and lose the greater battle. And over time in a marriage, if you don't figure this thing out, at some point along the way, even if they're small, this will only continue to grow and grow and morph and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I put in my notes, it said this way: the health and the future of your relationship is determined by how you handle your conflict. So we're going to talk about this specifically, and we're going to look at some practical things in Scripture around this. And so I'll say this, and I'll say some of this stuff, some of this and is going to be a great reminder. Some of this you know intellectually and you've never applied, right? So some of this today we're going to talk about is how do we apply it. And then some of this might be brand new. Like you weren't given a paradigm like this when you were growing up. You didn't see this at work in your parents or in the people that you admired. And so we're going to try to give like a baseline for that sort of thing. So around this, the first thing is this: that conflict resolution always begins with active listening. This sounds like you're laying on a couch listening to a psychologist talk to you, that line. And I don't know how to say it better, but this is true. The active listening part is something that you know and is also very hard, right? I remember reading this in Covey's book. Is it 7 Habits of Highly Effective? Yeah. And he talks about this idea of like trying to seek to understand before you're seeking to be understood. That never comes naturally to me. I don't ever wake up in the morning and go, oh, I just want to understand you better. I work, that is a discipline. I have more words than most in an argument, and they're not always angry. It's funny, I don't know what you guys are like. Sometimes when the argument gets more intense, I get less and less emotional, which makes it more and more intense. You know what I mean? Like this is a Jedi move that usually just ends up in me being a terrible person, right? There's a little bit of that where you go like, there's this part of it that I'm not active listening, and then the way that my brain works, and some of you are like this too, I have already formulated my response before they've ever responded to what I said. I don't know if you've ever done this before. I am crafty like that. I will already know what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it, that sort of thing before. Active listening goes, I'm going to put aside everything that I have to try to win this, so that I can be actively seeking to understand what it is that you think and what you need and what that looks like. And so the question around this is, how am I seeking to understand and respond to the other person? I don't miss this. Not the other person's argument, but the other person's heart. And some of you are more naturally wired to do this than other people, right? So I am not naturally wired to think that way. But at the end of the day, when we're in some sort of conflict, whatever the conflict is, the end goal for me is I'm ultimately looking to go, I want to know the other person's heart in this, not just their logic. I want to know the other person's heart in this, not just what the conflict is about. I want to hear all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. Now, there's an area of the Bible, it's called James. I love, this is one of my favorite areas of the Bible. It talks a lot about all sorts of different conflict and relational kind of stuff. It talks about, what it looks like to go through persecution and trials, all this sort of thing. But in James chapter 1, verse 19, it gives one of the more famous passages around this in the scripture, and it says this. It says, my dear brothers and sisters, right? Take note of this, right? Write it down, tattoo it somewhere, like put it on a wall, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, you've read this so much, can we just be really honest? You've heard this or read this so much that for many of us who have seen it, it doesn't even impact us. You kind of know it already says this. And I could read this a dozen times, like, yes, absolutely. And also, I am rarely the person who's quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. I got angry at somebody who cut me off the other day, but the problem was it was actually still my fault. I'm still angry at them. You know what I mean? The slowness of it doesn't happen like that. I can read this 1,000 times, and it's almost like, James, thank you so much. That's unhelpful. Why is it unhelpful? Because I know it, and I don't think about it enough, Now, the other part, too, some of the best marriage advice that I got, and I asked somebody who'd been married for like 35 to 40 years at this point. And they referenced this passage. And again, I was in my early 20s and I heard them say it. And I remember when they told me, and I said, yeah, if you were going to sum that up for me, like, again, it's pretty clear, but like, if you're going to sum it up, and I looked at the guy, I was like, what would you say? He goes, oh, it's really simple. In a fight, here's what you need to do. You just need to do this. That's your end goal. Shh, just stop talking. And I'm like, yeah, that's not that helpful. He like, you have no idea how helpful that's going to be, you know? Just listen and ask questions. Listen and ask more questions, right? Listen, and he said this, listen and ask questions until it's slightly annoying that you're asking the questions so that you can become so versed in the other person's side. Now, here's the other thing that you know, too. If you grew up in debate class or you did anything like this or persuasion of anything, you know this, that you can't ever really get into one of these things until you understand the position of the other person anyway. I took a debate class, or there's like a debate philosophical thing in college. And for the entire semester, I took every opposite position for the entirety of the semester. Because people, by the end of the semester, were like, man, he's real messed up. And the reason is I wanted to be so versed on the other side. And you know this too. In an argument, your goal isn't to win an argument, but the same principle applies in terms of knowing the other person's side before you fully formulate your own thing. Right? Now, again, it's a lot easier to say that than to do it. But I'll tell you this, the people who figure out a way, not just to shut up, but really the word that we talk about in our home a lot is just how do we pause? It's not that I'm not going to get a chance to speak, but I'm going to pause. Now, anybody remember the VHS players? You guys remember VHS players back in the day? It's funny now because I haven't used a VHS player since Blockbuster went out of business, right? So it's been a minute. But I'll never forget this. Back when we were doing that, we had a VHS player that you had to get up to press pause. Do you remember this? Which was so annoying. You know what I mean? So annoying. And I know this is probably cheesy, but that's the thing that I think about in my head. I have to press pause on my own thoughts. And almost every time that I press pause or have to do that, I have to stop and get up in my own brain. I have to get past the other things. It takes a certain level of discipline to get up and press the pause button. But I'll just say this. If you figure out a way to do that consistently, even at your most heightened emotional whatever, even when you are right and they are wrong, even when you are, whatever that is, if you press pause to understand, everything else will change about the rest of the argument. Proverbs 18 says it a slightly different way. It says this. It says, if one gives an answer before he hears, I love this, it is his folly, and I love this, and shame. You know what I mean? It's shameful. It's his folly and shame. He is no longer wise, and he has shame if one gives an answer before he hears. And this probably was written for me. And the whole, this is the thing, is like, Patrick. He could have put my name at the beginning. If you answer before you hear, right? And then there's another version of it, and it's a little bit earlier in Proverbs. It says this. It says, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. Now, this is the other fun part, too, that's so fascinating about our culture. So much of our culture speaks to your own individualism, your own, mental health, your own sanity, and these sorts of things, your own protection. So much of that is good. But there is a point to any principle like that if you take it so far, you can create such a protective nature in yourself that you actually don't think about the other person. That you actually, it says, don't lay down yourself, self-sacrifice in some ways to listen and hear from the other person, right? Can I just tell you, some of you in an argument, and this is my nature, I not only want to win, but I want to be self-protected as I win. And so one of the things you have to just acknowledge in a marriage, long-term relationship, if you're serious about the thing that you're in, right? Let's say this, is there will be times where you feel like you lost in a moment, that they got the better of the moment, that they even said something that might be hurtful to you. Right? And sometimes you need to create the boundary, absolutely. But then there are times, this where you have to just go, you know what? I'm going to let that pitch pass. Now, no one ever talks about this, but I'll just say this. If you swing at every pitch, you're going to strike out and you're going to look real foolish as you do. You know what I mean? Here's a fun thing. This. Not everything demands my response, right? Come on, as a leader, you know this too. Not everything demands my response. right? Not everything, not every, insult or critique, not every moment in a fight demands a response from me. And I'll say, Emily is the king of this, queen of this. She's unbelievable at this. There are moments where I will say something. You ever said something and like midway through you're like, oh crap. You ever done this before? You know what I mean? Like midway, as before it's even done. And here's what she's so good at. She's like a Jedi with this. That's 2 Jedi references today. She did this, right? She will let me say it. And then she will look at me and she won't have to say anything. And I will say, I'm sorry, as if it were part of the whole sentence that I did. You know what I'm saying? You ever done this before? Anybody ever done this? Like the entire sentence comes out of my mouth and by the end of it, I'm also attacking on, I'm so sorry. You know what I mean? Because I know, and you know what's so funny? That is not passive. That is wise, right? If you're always like gunslinging and ready to go and, whatever that, not literally, but you know what I mean? Like you're ready to fight that, you will be exhausted and you'll never win, right? And the other part too, can I just tell you this? And don't tell anybody else I said this, but people are flawed. They're going to say things that hurt you. If you get to the end of, 80, 90, 100 year, 120 year, we'll see how long you live, right? You get to the end of your life, the best marriages and the best relationships all have some version of pain and scars and difficulty in their own pieces of the story. If you expect to get there unharmed or sort of like offended at some point or somebody never hurt you, that's just not a real relationship, right? And that's not even in movies anymore. Like we just kind of did away with that. You will. What is fascinating and what makes marriages healthy is how do you go, hey, now there's limits and we have to be wise and I think you should be in counseling, all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, you go like, there's some pitches I'm gonna let pass. There are some things I'm gonna go, you know what? You were wrong and you were mad and that wasn't even about me, I came in the other day all amped up about something that had nothing to do with my family. But I took it out on our family. I was like, and I got to the end of it. You know what? Emily was so kind and so gracious. And she let me know that what I was doing was not great. And at the same time, by the end of the day, she also had grace for me and my own like mess coming into it. And I would just say this. So, and you know this, then you have to be like quick to apologize when that's the case. And you all know that. One of the things that we do at our house is, now we make our kids do this, but like if we do something that's kind of against somebody in our family, we'll have our kids say, I'm sorry, and then ask the question, how can I make it better? Which is great in parenting, but then when you're the parent and you have to go apologize and go, how can I make it better? And they're like, Barbies. That's how we're going to make it better today. Like, you're going to play Barbies and we're going to dress you up. Like that's great too. But there's a piece of this where you go, I want to reciprocate that, and I know that I'm not going to be perfect. We all know each other's not going to be perfect. But at the end of the day, we sometimes just got to figure out what that looks like. I went for a long time on that. All right, the other verse I'm going to look at is this. This is Proverbs chapter 10. It says this. It says, I love this. When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Can I just say, like, this is one of those things, you know this. As much as you want to say all the things that you want to say, and as much as you want to go as far as you want to go in the argument, you know this. The mature person in the relationship recognizes it's not about the number of words that I say. It is about, am I pausing to listen and understand? Now, this is the pushback to that for me, which I would be saying as well, is this. What if what they're saying is wrong or doesn't make sense? Can I just say, what if what they're saying is wrong? Oh, is that I don't like bugs. Do you see that? Fly. I saw everybody look at it at the same time. Y'all got one of those salt things? I'm just kidding. All right. Nah, I'm not good, man. And now we're immediately taking the 10:30 service. See how that worked? That was great. Not today, Satan. I do not like you. Oh, it's a moth. Oh, we're good. It's not a bee. It's a moth. We're good. If it was a bee, this sermon would have just ended. I'll just tell you that right now. That would have been great. All right, so let me tell you. Now, I want to step on it, but I'm not going to do that because some of you would turn me in. It would be on video, and that'd be what goes viral. All right, so, yeah. It's like watching me. I feel, I'll just preach to that. Anyway, all right, so the restraint and the prudent thing is this, that there will be, the pushback is that what if they're wrong? What if the logic's off? That sort of thing. Let me just tell you, out the gate. Can I just tell you out the gate? is that will be the case. And sometimes the silence and the letting them process it out loud is actually the thing that helps them get to where they need to be anyway. And so you're like, man, that takes a lot of work. And I'm like, that is relationships. That's the work of relationships. It's figuring out what does the other person need. So the question is this, how do we listen well? Before we ever figure out the speaking thing, how do we work to listen well? So there's a couple things around this, and this is where we'll spend our time, is this, you have to give focused attention to the other person. All right, now there's all sorts of fun stats around this, and you could go look these up on your own, but some version of this is true, is that about 7% of what you say is actually the words that you say, it's the verbal, about 38% is your tone of voice, about 55% is your body language. Now I'll just tell you this, if you want to figure out how to be a great communicator, this is me, right? I would say this. Focusing in on the tone of voice and the body language with which you say things unique to your spouse, right? Now, I would say this. You can talk about this with like public speaking. Some of you did this, or like the ways that you talk in general to people. And all that's great. None of that's relevant to your spouse. What's great about being married, what's great about being engaged is this. You've said, hey, you're like my person. And so for the rest of my life, I'm not just trying to figure this out for everybody. I'm trying to figure this out for you. One of the things that I work to do in our marriage all the time is how does my body language or my tone affect not everybody, but Emily, right? How does it affect Henry and Eleanor and Oliver? And all four of those people in our house experience me different, right? Experience my tone different. If I get really amped and excited in our house about the Braves, one of my kids takes that as aggression. I have to be mindful of that. I'm happy. I'm just loud. And you know what I mean? But one of my kids takes that aggression. Now, Emily and I grew up in different households where in our house, we yelled more. They didn't yell. And I learned this early on in our relationship. Now, I'm not a big yeller, but I'd say if I get amped, I'm like, hey, I don't get more. That's the most preachy I get. I'm like, I'm trying to get you to understand. And what she feels from that is aggression from me. Right? And so I'll just say, I have to work on my tone of voice, and then I'm working on my body language. I learned this one time. I went up to high five somebody, and I went in hard for this. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, let's go. And they stepped back. And over several conversations, I realized this person had abuse in their background. I had never thought about that before in my life. I was like, now, people sometimes kid me. They'll joke around. They're like, kid me. No, joke around with me. I ask before I hug women now. I do that. And why do you do that? I was like, because this person, I went up to hug this lady one time, and she did this. I was like, I never thought about how she wasn't afraid I was going to hit her, but there was an immediate response. I felt, now those are fairly extreme circumstances, but it's like Emily, and we won't go into this too deeply, but Emily has her own ways that she experiences me. And as a spouse, this is really getting into it. I want to spend my life learning Emily. Right? What does she respond best to? How do we do this well? What does that look like? I'll give you one small example of this. So I joked earlier, when we get in a fight or a conflict or something like that, the more emotional it gets, and sometimes I'll be the one that starts it emotional. I tend to lower, I turn into Ben Stein by the end of it. You know what I'm saying? I'm just it's just I'm very factual, very whatever, which can make her feel more emotion around that. And I finally I said, how do I do this better? And she goes, I need to know, you're in it with me in a fight. And so I had to work on that over the years. And so what's funny is I don't yell, but sometimes it'll be really awkward because I will feel less emotion and then try to express it. Then it's just yeah, it feels like that a little bit, it doesn't feel great, you're wrong, but in my head, I just want to be no, but that's what she needs. I'll never forget the day she looked at me one time, she goes, sometimes in our biggest fight, I just need to know, we're good, and I love, just hug me in the middle of a fight. I'm like, hug you in the middle of a fight? I feel like a bear hug or something, and then, so now it's just yeah, I love you. I don't know. It didn't feel right. But there's a piece of me, and that's all very over-exaggerated, but there's a piece of me that I'd go hey, how do I communicate uniquely to her? She's asking the same question of me. All of that really kind of gets into it. All right, the other one is this. Give focused attention to the person. Listen with acceptance and understanding. This is one of those things I'd say the best question that you can answer or ask in any sort of conflict or relationship is going, I'm going to listen beyond their words. I'm listening for the feelings in the heart. For many of us, that doesn't come naturally, but I want to know what's going on. The end goal is not that I win this argument. The end goal for our marriage is that we make it to 97 years old and she likes me more than she liked me when we started, right? That's what I'm hoping in that. And so the question that we're working on a lot is like, what do you need from me in this moment? Now, the other part too that I'll just tell you, and this is what makes this hard and great at the same time, is the person that you marry will have a version 1, a version 2, a version 3, a version 96. It's all seasonal. Everyone's shifting and changing. Everyone's growing. Everybody's doing these sort of things. In marriage, you got to figure out how to do that together, which means I'm not asking what version 1 at 20 years old Emily at Lee University is thinking and feeling, right? I'm asking what version, pick a number, of Emily now is thinking and feeling, and how do I respond to that in the most healthy way? I want to listen with acceptance and understanding, but acceptance of who she is now and understanding of who she is now. Now, again, this feels like, this is like a math problem. There's so many steps and all of that. That's true, but some of this is just going, how do you create triggers in your brain so that when tension comes up, you're applying these principles of Scripture on how to be able to be, slow to anger, slow to speak, quick to listen and understand these sorts of things. So you're listening with acceptance and understanding. The next one is a cheesy phrase, but it's just so true that I don't know how else to not cover it. Is you've got to figure out a way as quickly as you can in any argument to attack the issue at hand, not the person. All right, so the longer you're with somebody, and you know this, you know what like the nuclear button is. Like at some point you realize that if I press this button, they're going to shut down. I'm going to walk away. There's going to be like a walkout song. It's likely going to be Space Jam. Like everybody's going to clap for you. You won the argument. Nuh-uh. It's a moth. Better be a moth or you're going to see something fun. Anyway, so, all right. So there's this part where you go like, hey, if that's the case, right? If that's the case, when I think about this, we're not going to start there, but I want to attack the issue as fast as we can get there and not the person. So the best thing that I would tell you around this is all of like your nuclear arsenal of the past and family stuff and insecurities and all that stuff. This is what I tell you, and this kind of messes people up sometimes. They're like, really? I think you need to name them and know them because you have already named them and you already know them. Write it down. I don't know if I'd tell them. I wouldn't show them, but like you know what they are. Don't pretend that you don't know. You know. So name it and acknowledge it and then put it in a box and lock it and set it on fire and kick it over there to the moth, right? Like, what are you going to do? And here's what I say. Put it away and don't pull it out. Right, so there's a piece of you, though, when you feel like you're losing, the moment you feel like you need to pull one of the nuclear things out of the arsenal to win the argument, can I just tell you something? The moment you feel that is the moment that you know that you're trying to win, right? It's the moment, because none of that's helpful. None of that's like, you don't pull any of that out and they go, oh, thank you. Now I see how this connects to da-da-da-da-da. No, it's like, or even worse, this is when, you say it, and then it stops immediately, and they remove themselves. And you go, well, now we're not even attacking the issue or the person. It just feels over. So take all your nuclear arsenal, and the minute one of those comes to your mind, you go, I'm trying to win. And the best thing that you could do is either remove yourself from the conversation for a minute, and this is what I need. I need Emily to go, hey, I'm going to step back for a minute, and we'll come back and revisit this in 10 minutes, an hour, whatever that is, because I just want to get to the bottom of it. But I would say put it aside. The minute you feel it, go, hey, I'm not gonna do that. Put it aside. I'll say this: the more you use that stuff, the less you're actually gonna be winning in the relationship, and the more contempt you're actually gonna breed. And so just don't name it because you already have. Know that you have it in your back pocket, and then just go, I'm not gonna do that. And then the real great part, the overly spiritual part, you ready? Is just don't. Don't do it. All right, and the other one is this, right? Proverbs 15, it says it this way, which really speaks to this. Like a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word will stir up anger. Which I would just tell you this. My version of this is some version of condescension, and it's not that. It's not being less emotional. You can be less emotional and wildly condescending and do the exact same thing. It's not that. I'll just say this. The gentle part about this goes, I recognize you as a human. I recognize you as flawed. I recognize you as having a bad day. I recognize you in this moment of I've brought stuff to this too. I recognize you in the fullness of your humanity and whatever version of yourself you are. And I'm going to respond with gentleness to that human. I'm going to see you, not all of the stuff that makes me want to win. And I'll say this, and I said this earlier, and when you don't, and the fight gets out of hand, or, you know what I mean, it turns bad, and you say the thing, you pull out the nuclear stuff, or whatever it is, whenever that happens, what we say in our house, and this is given to us early on, but it's so true, is this, that he who is mature, or is most mature, will make the first move towards reconciling the relationship. Can I say this too? Most people think of reconciling relationships once it feels like relationships are over or too far gone. The work of marriage is reconciling relationships as quickly as you can, even in the small moments. Emily and I got in a fight over donuts one time, like donuts. And I was wrong, and it wasn't about the donuts. And I'll just tell you this, it got so big. We were traveling too. It was so big, and kids were in the back seat. And, you know, it was like, oh, man, we were so imperfect in it. And by we, I mean me. And it was just not great. I'll never forget this stuff. We're never mad at each other for very long. We don't do that very long. But I would say she was the one who made the step towards the maturity of the first move to make things right. And she wasn't even the one that was wrong in the thing. And so I'll just tell you this, if you're like me, I'm always waiting for the person who is wrong to take the first step. The problem with that is the other person is always wrong when we're in a conflict and fight. So I'll just tell you, you ready? Some of you feel less or weaker if you're the person who makes the first move to do this. Can I just tell you? That's not how that works. Maturity is what drives you to make the first move towards reconciliation. It's not the person who, because especially in marriage, this isn't true of all relationships, but especially in marriage, most of the time we're both a little bit wrong. And most of the time I'm a lot of bit wrong. But the person who makes the first move is always the person who's mature. The other two things that we talk about in our home is this. We don't go to sleep angry. It doesn't mean we solve everything. We just don't go to sleep angry. We just work to do that. We work to figure out the emotional, how do we neutralize the emotion of anger before we go to sleep, right? And that's hard to do. That's not always easy. Sometimes we stay up later and get a little bit less sleep. And the other one is this. We don't fight in bed. Now, this is one for us. I would just say the bed's not meant for fighting. It's meant for sleeping, and that was weird. But we're already not taking this because of the moth, so we're good. You're welcome. 9 o'clock gets all the fun stuff. You know what I mean? 10:30, it's the most boring talk ever, you know? That's it. And here's why this matters so much. Ready? This matters to us because conflict is often connected to a place or a space. Many of you remember your biggest fights and where you were. I don't want to make those kind of memories in our bedroom. That's not what we're trying to do. So we will get up and leave. We will go to the kitchen or the dining room. We have this little loft area, so it was in the loft. We don't fight in bed, and we don't go to bed with anger. Doesn't mean we solve everything before we go to bed, but we will wait until we're not angry. Sometimes that means that we're both awake in different parts of the house. For us, it usually doesn't take that long because at some point or another, we want to remind each other of kind of the values that we have here. I put this in my notes, similar to what we said earlier, but I never want to view it, right? I never want to view it as if I'm fighting with the other person, but I'm always fighting for the relationship. That shift will always kind of help you get to the heart of it before. And then I'll say two more things and we'll wrap up. This is, again, very practical, but I'll say two more things and we'll wrap up. The other part of this for me is I hear people and I'll watch people. We'll go to restaurants sometime, and we'll watch older couples who don't seem to like each other. Have you ever seen this before? This was one of the most pivotal things for me. I decided early, and Emily had already decided earlier, we don't want to get to that age and not enjoy each other. Right? This is a guiding thing, which means there are times where I'm willing to shift to be more likable because I want her to like me. So I'm like, well, individuality, and if you got to change yourself for the other person, I'm like, yeah, well, sounds good. But then you're 10 years into marriage and go, nah, I probably should wear more deodorant. You know what I mean? She's probably right about that, you know? I'd say this, like for us, we talk about this, that we'll say this to each other sometimes, or versions of it. You have to love me my whole life because you said you would. So you got to do that. All right. But I also want you to like me too, which means two things for me, that I choose to like her, right? And then I also want to become the most likable version of me for her. And here's what that means, right? You're not trying to be likable for everybody, and you're not trying to be likable for you. You're likable for them. What did they like? What did they have preferences on? What matters to them? And I'll say this, so you can take this to an unhealthy place, and absolutely. And there's a fear around that, there's boundaries around that, a lot of conversation exists there. But for most couples, like most average couples, there's a healthiness to it that you're not going to take it too far. And that really matters, right? I put in my notes too, I said this, you got to go the extra mile to be really good for the other person, right? You gotta figure out, we're going to go the extra mile to be good. I'm going to say two more things and then we're going to wrap up because I know I've gone longer. Other than this, I say this to people when it comes to conflict. Sometimes we yell. We try not to do that in front of the kids. But we will run from sarcasm. Right, this is something about our house, and I would say, I say this about Emily all the time. Emily is she is so smart. She is wickedly smart. And then for us in our fights, I'll just say this, we're so good at this. We've just decided, and we know this, most people who are pretty intelligent can get sarcastic quick. The problem is it erodes intimacy when you're sarcastic because it's always a form of condescension, right? Now, sometimes it's fun. You do this with your friends, or, your whatever. That's great. But in marriage, like you don't meet people who are in a mean way sarcastic to each other and then have a great date afterwards. That doesn't happen. Midway through the date, if you're sarcastic, it just doesn't work. I put in my notes that said intimacy. We've just seen this. Intimacy dies at the hands of being publicly cutting and privately condescending. All right. If you are publicly cutting to your spouse, it's just eroding intimacy. You just can't. You just don't do that. We talk about this a lot. I'm going to be her biggest fan in public, because I am. I genuinely am. But even in a hard day, I'm going to still do that. She does that with me. We don't talk bad about each other to other people. We just don't do that. And we just don't. And then privately, we just work hard not to be condescending. In fact, we want it to feel odd. Now, if somebody's going to be the person who does this in our marriage, it's generally going to be me. And if I'm going to be condescending, we're to the point now in marriage where it just feels weird. It's almost laughable. When I pull that card, it's like you already lost whatever it is you were trying to win. And so we want to make that abnormal in our house. Now, I'm going to say this is the kind of where we're going to end. We're going to wrap up, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to pray for us, and then we're just going to end, if that works for you guys. Josh, I don't know if Josh is in the room. Sorry. Yeah. Hey, Josh. How you doing? We're just going to wrap up because I gave the moth. I went long. Anyway, all right. I'm going to say one last thing. Some of you in the room, you don't have kids. Some of you in the room, you're not married, and this is kind of far off. Or some of you in the room are single, and you're not even dating anybody, but you're like, hey, you're thinking about marriage. I'll tell you, for me, this is how I started thinking about this early. I think about this now a lot. And that's this. Before I ever got married, I assumed that one day I would be a father. And if I was going to be a father, what I knew is I didn't get a version of a healthy marriage growing up. It was just me and my mom, single parent home, all this kind of stuff. And I just determined early that whatever we were going to build was really going to be, because of proximity, it was going to be picked up on by our kids, right? So I'll put this up here. We'll all say all together because they're cute. And then after that, yeah, that was so good. That was almost on cue. That was weird. That was great. And yes, I put it up there to get the all. I don't even care. Yeah. Right, let me say this, right? So in our marriage, this is what we talk about a lot. And one of the things that drive us to is we talked about, like, where are we going to end when we're 85, 90, the likability stuff for sure. But here's what I know, right? Even if you don't have kids yet, even if maybe you don't even want kids, but at some point, if you are going to have kids, before you're married, once you get married, or if you have kids now, right? They will listen to everything that you say, but they will pick up everything that you do. And I used to be super skeptical of this. I was like, no. Maybe when they're teenagers. And I look at our kids now and I'm like, Henry's 7, and I watched him. I was like, man, that's me. You got that from me, and I told you to do the opposite. But you watched that. Oliver picked up a brand new word the other day that we try not to say in public at church. I'm like, where did you hear that? Oh yeah, I know where you heard that. It was that driver that cut me off. Anyway, there's a little bit of that, you pick it up in proximity. I'll tell you this, if you have boys, your boys will pick up how to treat women by the way that you treat their mom and how you treat her mom and your mom. They're going to pick it up. They're going to know, right? I'll tell you this. And again, you've heard this and you know this, but it's so true. Like if you have daughters, right? You know, your daughters will pick up how to be treated. They will. They will pick it up. The standard that is set for every guy that will come after you will be set by you. And they will either respond to that against, like, I don't want someone like my dad, or they'll go like, no, that's the standard. I want to get that thing we talk about in our house all the time. And I'll pray this, like, God, help Eleanor to marry an even a better man than me. Right? We talk about this in our house because I want the standard to be high. I want to live to that. And I'll just say this. If you're building your marriage, you're not just building it for you. You're building it for the people or the kids that will come after you, which means that your conflict matters. The way you love and serve each other matters. How quickly you come back and apologize matters. Right? The ways that you treat each other and honor each other. The ways that you go, hey, we failed. We have family meetings to talk about, if we mess up or if there's a culture that's being set. We talk about that stuff. And so I'll just say this. Build a marriage that you wish for your children to have one day. Even if you don't have kids, right? That's the standard. Build a marriage that you wish for your kids to have one day. Now, I've done this throughout the series. I've just overloaded you with a lot of content as we've done this, a lot of practical stuff. So here's how we're gonna wrap up, and I'm gonna pray for you. But here's what I want you to do, just for a second. I talked about a ton of things today, so I'm gonna ask you just for a second, if you would, just close your eyes for a second, bow your heads, and I'm gonna ask you a really simple thing. Of all the stuff that we talked about in conflict, there's not like 5 or 6 for most of us. There's probably like 1 or 2. What's the 1 or 2 things that bubbles up in you that tends to create unhealth in either your friendships, relationships, your dating relationships, your engagement, your marriage? What are 1 or 2 of those things that bubble up? And of all the stuff that we talked about, if you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, what I'm going to ask you to do is just say, God, I'm going to give you that thing, and I'm going to work on that thing, right? There's not like 20 things around it. I'm going to give you that thing. I'm going to work on that thing. And if you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, I tell people this all the time. It is totally okay, I think, to pray to the ceiling. It's like, if you're up there, help me get better at this thing. And that's all right, too. If you're not a follower of Jesus, maybe that's your prayer. Where you're like, I don't know if you're up there. I've been trying to do this by myself, trying to do this on my own strength. I'm not getting there. I don't know all the stuff about Christianity, but God, if you're up there, help me to do better at this thing. And then we believe that he will, and he'll come alongside of you. So, Father, thank you so much for this truth. Thank you that you care enough about us to give us like super practical things about how to relate and care for and love one another. Father, I pray that you would help us not to be perfect, because we're not going to be perfect, but help us to live the kind of lives that model what you taught. Help us to be followers of the way, not just in belief, but in the ways that we build marriages, in the way that we build around conflict, the way that we pass on to the next generation what it looks like to love and care for one another in marriage. God, help us to do that. The person who's here and it feels like their relationship is in shambles or painful, or some people showed up today maybe where it's like, this is like the last thing. We're working on this, but it feels hopeless. God, I pray that you would give them hope. God, I pray that you would help them to figure out what to do. God, I pray that for the person who's like flirting with disaster because of the habits or principles that they've allowed in, God, I pray that you would just break those things in them and they come to you humbly and submit, and that you would empower them to live the way that you've called them to live. And God, I pray very simply for those of us who end up getting married, for those of us who have families in that way. Father, I pray that you would help us to get to the end of our lives and not be the couple that's sitting at whatever restaurant, silent and not talking. But God, that you would help us to get there with so much joy that it feels infectious to other people. And then we get to the end of our lives, and God, that we love and like the person that we're with.